Imagine surviving 4 years of civil war, keeping the United States together, and finally seeing your enemy surrender. 5 days later, you go to the theater, and someone shoots you from behind. That was how Abraham Lincoln's presidency ended. On April 14th, 1865, Lincoln was watching a comedy at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Mary. Behind him was one of America's most famous actors, John Wilkes Booth. And Booth wasn't there for the show. The American Civil War was basically over. Just 5 days earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Washington erupted in celebration. John Wilkes Booth saw things very differently. Booth was 36, famous, charismatic, and came from a successful acting family. He was also a fanatical supporter of the Confederacy, who supported slavery, and absolutely despised Lincoln. Originally, Booth didn't plan to kill him. He wanted to kidnap him. In late 1864, Booth gathered a small group of conspirators and planned to capture Lincoln, take him south, and use him to force the Union into releasing Confederate prisoners. Pretty ambitious, considering their target was the President of the United States. They even prepared weapons, escape routes, and safe houses. But their kidnapping attempt never happened. Then Richmond fell, Lee surrendered, and Booth's plan became much darker. On April 11th, Lincoln gave a speech outside the White House and suggested that some black men, particularly educated men and black Union veterans, should eventually receive voting rights. Booth was listening in the crowd. He was furious. According to one of his associates, Booth decided Lincoln had to die. 3 days later, Booth visited Ford's Theater and discovered Lincoln would be attending a performance that evening. And Booth knew the building extremely well. He had performed there himself. He knew the entrances, backstage areas, and exactly where the presidential box was. That evening, Lincoln and Mary arrived to watch Our American Cousin, joined by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris. Presidential security at the time was nothing like it is today. Lincoln had no modern Secret Service detail surrounding him. Booth, meanwhile, had decided Lincoln wasn't the only target. He wanted to cripple the American government in one night. Booth would kill Lincoln, Lewis Powell would kill Secretary of State William Seward, and George Atzerodt would kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. 3 attacks, same evening. At around 10:15, Booth entered Ford's Theater carrying a small single-shot Derringer pistol and a knife. Nobody immediately panicked. He was a famous actor walking around a theater where people knew him. Booth moved upstairs towards Lincoln's box. He knew the play well and apparently waited for one of its biggest laughs, hoping the audience noise would help cover the gunshot. He entered the box. Lincoln was sitting directly in front of him. Booth raised the pistol towards the back of Lincoln's head and fired. 1 shot. Lincoln immediately collapsed unconscious. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone rushed Booth, but Booth pulled out his knife and badly slashed Rathbone's arm. Booth then climbed over the front of the box and jumped onto the stage below. He injured his left leg during the escape, but kept moving. Booth crossed the stage and reportedly shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning, "thus always to tyrants." Then he ran backstage, escaped through a rear door, jumped onto a waiting horse, and disappeared into Washington. Inside the theater, chaos took over. A doctor in the audience, Charles Leal, reached Lincoln and quickly realized the wound was catastrophic. Lincoln was still breathing, but he never regained consciousness. Doctors decided moving him all the way to the White House was pointless. Instead, Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house and placed diagonally on a bed because he was too tall to fit normally. Meanwhile, Booth's wider plan was going badly. Lewis Powell reached Secretary of State William Seward's house and attacked him with a knife. Seward was badly injured, but survived. George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Instead, he lost his nerve. He spent part of the evening drinking and never attempted the attack. So Booth had one successful attack, one failed attack, and one conspirator who basically went drinking instead. At 7:22 the following morning, April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56. Andrew Johnson became president, and one of the biggest manhunts in American history began. Booth had already escaped Washington with another conspirator, David Harold. The pair traveled into Maryland and collected weapons and supplies that had originally been hidden for the kidnapping plot. Booth's injured leg was becoming a serious problem, so they stopped at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated the fracture. By now, Booth's name was everywhere. Soldiers and detectives were searching across the region. Booth had apparently expected at least some people to view him as a hero. Instead, much of the country viewed him as exactly what he was, an assassin. Booth and Harold spent days hiding in woods and moving between Confederate sympathizers while trying to reach Virginia. At one point, they attempted to cross the Potomac River at night and managed to end up back in Maryland. Not ideal when thousands of people are looking for you. Eventually, they reached Virginia. On April 24th, they arrived at the farm of Richard Garrett near Port Royal. Booth used a fake name and claimed he was a former Confederate soldier. The family initially allowed him to stay, then they became suspicious. 2 days later, Union cavalry surrounded the farm. Booth and Harold were hiding inside a tobacco barn. Soldiers ordered them to surrender. Harold gave himself up. Booth refused. Authorities set fire to the barn to force him out. Through the flames, Sergeant Boston Corbett saw Booth moving inside and fired. The bullet hit Booth in the neck. Soldiers dragged him from the barn and placed him on the farmhouse porch. A few hours later, John Wilkes Booth died. The manhunt had lasted 12 days, but authorities were still hunting everyone connected to the conspiracy. Lewis Powell was arrested, George Atzerodt was captured, David Harold had surrendered, and Mary Surratt, whose boarding house had been used by Booth and the conspirators, was also arrested. A military tribunal convicted several members of the group. On July 7th, 1865, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were executed by hanging. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by the United States federal government, although debate over exactly how much she knew about the assassination has continued ever since. Booth believed killing Lincoln would somehow help the defeated Confederacy. It didn't. The Confederacy was finished, and slavery was ending, and Booth had killed a president who had actually argued for a relatively lenient approach towards bringing the southern states back into the Union. Lincoln had survived 4 years of civil war. He had watched the Union finally defeat the Confederacy. Then, 5 days after Lee surrendered, he went to watch a comedy. A famous actor walked into the theater, waited for the audience to laugh, walked up behind him, and fired one shot. Abraham Lincoln lived long enough to see the Union survive, but not long enough to see what came next. This has been Comic Book Cases. Thanks for joining us on today's deep dive into the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, stay curious, and we'll catch you on the next one.